So what I'm going to do today is a bit of, I actually, in response to some of what I was seeing and seeing again on Twitter and hearing, watching, and I think I saw at least one other speaker say this, that I've actually, shifted a little bit, not shifted my thesis, but tried to reflect on some of what I heard and hopefully have this as either adding more context or maybe responding or agreeing with a lot of what I heard. And so a lot of what you'll see in this presentation, and I'll get to my sort of main thesis after a few, what I guess are throat clearing slides. What you'll see are examples that you've seen actually over the past few days and even over the past years. Some of the examples, whether they're of papers, whether they're of particular incidents, whether they're of reactions to any of those incidents. You've seen those before. In fact, again, you've probably seen some of them, a lot of them in the last couple of days. I know you have. But I want to, again, offer my take on how they all fit together or don't. And so I apologize in advance for repeating some of the material that you've seen before, but I hope that in doing so, I will be able to suggest some things. And my final sort of opening comment, if you will, is I am very well aware that as I again was listening and as I'm speaking to you all today, of the strong possibility, or at least the likelihood, that some of my comments may end up being, and even maybe rightfully, interpreted as somewhat, if you will, Luddite, or even sort of not necessarily pro-technology. And I really don't mean them that way, and actually very vehemently, that's not how I feel. However, I do think it's really important to keep the human element of all of these discussions and the requirement, the absolute requirement for human judgment, which I always want to make sure is part of this, and I'll get to why in a moment. So let me begin here. So there's this guy on the screen. I guess I'm on the screen twice now if you have me in your window, but that's me. I look more or less like that. I think that picture's from a couple of years ago. But as you can see, the caption, which I believe is quite appropriate, is Ivan Oransky, not a COVID-19 expert. I'm barely an expert in anything, and COVID-19 is certainly not any on that list. This was a post from just about a week ago now, maybe a little longer. And depending if you read the entire post or just saw the headline or saw neither, you may have some different sort of take on what the headline means. But what it actually refers to, and it's already, by the way, out of date because another one of these review requests came just a couple of days ago. What this refers to is I, over the past month, a little more than a month now, have now received 5 different requests to review papers about COVID-19 from, these are all Elsevier journals. Now, we all know why that's happening, but the reason I bring this up, other than to hopefully just, sort of have a little bit of fun with it, which is really what we're trying to do, is to point out that this is almost certainly because algorithms have chosen me as a peer reviewer, because I have, in fact, published a letter to the editor about COVID-19, retractions. And so therefore, algorithms believe, wrongly, that I'm an expert in COVID-19. I can assure you I'm not, and please don't send me any more requests unless you actually want me to write another post like this, which I suppose I could always do. My point there is not so much that the algorithm's bad. It's that none of the editors actually bothered to check who they were inviting to peer review. So humanity, very important. Human judgment, critical. Not part of this equation, bad. Okay, moving on. How else does automation and algorithms, and I think that they're somewhat interchangeable, but that's probably because I'm not a very sophisticated computer scientist. So apologies in advance for probably mangling those two terms, but I hope that you'll forgive me for that and also allow a little bit of, well, journalistic license in terms of bringing these things together. This was a piece, a feature article, piece of journalism that Adam Marcus, who's my co-founder at Retraction Watch, and Kat Ferguson, who was our staff writer at the time. Actually, I take that back. She was actually our intern at the time. She became our staff writer. In many ways, even more impressive that she was able to pick this up so quickly. This was, again, and many of you are aware of the issue here, which is fake peer review. We again published this in Nature. And the problem here really, it boiled down to the fact that one of the content management systems, and arguably both of the major ones, were basically allowing editors to send out invitations for peer review based on recommended reviewers, which we could have a whole other discussion on, but certainly, in the abstract and sort of theoretically is sort of okay if you at least vet them. There was no vetting going on. And so people were using fake email addresses. And the way the system was set up, there was a way to check those email addresses. Nobody was doing it because they had not been either encouraged to do so or just it wasn't part of the workflow. And so again, no human was actually checking. They thought they were checking, but they weren't really checking. Again, example number 2, automation. Okay, so here's a journal that, again, thanks to, again, sort of some rules based on Turnitin, right, based on authenticate, said to any particular authors, when they were trying to solicit manuscripts, 19% plagiarism is just okay, that's fine. In fact, we had that repeated to us when we contacted one of the editors of the journal, so it wasn't just us sort of misreading something. Why did this happen? Because the threshold that the Higher Education Commission in Pakistan said was okay was 19%. Now, is it really that 19% is fine? No, it's just that was an arbitrary threshold that, again, without any judgment, no one really understood. And so you could just submit a paper and you could run it through Authenticate, as many authors do, and just sort of tweak it until you get to 18.5%, and then you're okay. That is very far from the spirit of, I think, of what is intended when even this journal, which I don't think made a good decision here, but again, made this decision. Again, a final example, and then I'll move on to my sort of bigger picture, hopefully, ideas, or at least I think they're bigger picture. This is a post from Lira Pachter from a number of years ago now, 2014. And again, I want to point to it, and I'll tell please go look at the post. It's fascinating. Lira did some really interesting work here. But I bring it to your attention because I want to point out that this is, again, purely based on the fact that metrics, and you heard, of course, from Mario Bajoli about this, but metrics are, prized above anything else. And this basically what happened was a university in Saudi Arabia jumped up to the top 10 of mathematics sort of programs in the rankings, US News and World Report rankings, by basically hiring all these very famous mathematicians to be adjunct professors for, I think it was $70,000 a year. Fact check me on that. They didn't ever really have to do very much for the university, very, very little. But what they did have to do was add the university's name as a sort of tertiary, if you will, or quaternary even, affiliation, so that when people went to do citation analysis and when they went to do whether or not, how many papers had been published by a particular university or by the faculty of a particular university, there they were all of a sudden, even though none of the papers were actually primarily from those universities. So again, some examples of when, if we are not careful, I mean, again, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anyone, but I just felt that it was important for all of us who are thinking about these critical issues to remember the importance of human judgment, of critical thinking and of human judgment. And I'm going to, again, actually, I just wanted to, I like to pull out this quote when I have a sense that people are getting a little bit too, sort of, I don't know, it's not necessarily in love with technology, but sort of complacent about, where we are. This is 1987. Daniel Koshland, may he rest in peace, of course, was the editor of Science at the time, had testified in in front of the Senate. You'll remember this person named Al Gore, who actually pulled those together, just to give you a little bit more of a context and history lesson. So 99.9999, I mean, that is a lot of significant digits, right? Percent of research is accurate and truthful. So really, let's not, make all these changes in order to, sort of upset the apple cart, if you will. Things are going just fine. Things have changed a great deal. The ORI, and I know there's some representatives from the ORI, and this is a sponsored conference, et cetera. So obviously well aware, there's a whole history there. But, and I'll come back to this, it's a question of whether or not this general sense has permeated our sense of whether or not things are going well and how much change we have to make. So here's my thesis, okay? And again, this is where I probably start to sound a little bit Luddite, or even maybe devil's advocate, although I really, again, don't certainly intend to sound that way, but I can appreciate that. So again, and what I've hopefully sort of made the case for, at least you understand my case if you don't agree, even if you don't agree with it, is that automation and algorithms will only make things worse without the will and the resources, including human staff. We've heard a lot about, again, automation and various technology, which I think is terrific, and I want to underscore that, but without actually doing something with it, right? And that's where the will comes in. And with the history of this, and again, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anyone who has been hearing any of the speakers before me or seeing the conversations. The history so far is that a lot of the players do not either lack the will or the resources or both to properly deal with what they're already getting. And so if we simply create more flags and more sort of there might be something to look at there without thinking about how to resource that, and actually without taking steps so that we know, and as outsiders, really, I'm really an outsider, that there is will, and sending messages about the will there to do something about these issues. I don't think we're going to make things better. I think we may make things worse. I did train, as Daniel said, although I'm not licensed and I don't practice medicine, I did train in medicine. And this is a bit like if you suddenly say, well, we're going to screen everyone for X disease or for all these diseases. And you will find more cases, no question. You'll find a lot of false positives, which is one of the issues. But you will find a lot of real cases. And then you don't actually have any more healthcare professionals to handle that. Well, what's going to happen? You're going to have a lot more people running around, right, with diagnoses that don't get treated. That's going to only make things worse. And that's the situation we're in now already, without this sort of fire hose that I could very well see coming out of a lot of these technologies. Again, relatedly, when as an institution, and I say this about universities, I say about federal agencies, and I say it about publishers, institutions send a message when they under-resource or outsource either quality assurance. And I really firmly believe, and 10 years of Retraction Watch have only reinforced this belief, that in doing so, they are undermining their own claims of integrity and added value. I can be challenged on that. I'm frequently challenged on that, but it actually has, I've not been dissuaded from that, what I think of as an evidence-based opinion. And I put everyone in, and I know that decision makers vary by each of those institutions, but there's a thread there. We are constantly told to trust the process. I'm actually, and people are, I think, sometimes surprised by this if they, meet me the first time or hear something about my work. I'm actually, in many ways, an incrementalist. I actually believe in this system. I'm not a radical, a revolutionary. On the other hand, when I see a process that is as broken as the correction mechanisms, the correction mechanisms are in scientific publishing, I really have to just remind everyone that rings hollow. And in fact, what I hear frequently from people is that is one of the things, if not the main thing, that drives people out of science, because they see no effort to actually take these issues on, and yet everyone's allowed to continue going, and it's disheartening at best, completely demoralizing at worst, to the point where people are retaliated against because they do these things. That's beyond either of those characterizations. And finally, I think we always have to come back to why algorithms and metrics are ruling to begin with. I defer to Mario, whose work I just think so much of and read voracious. Whenever I see an alert about a new paper from him, I read. He's got a lot of this thinking so done so well. But it really is true that when algorithms and metrics, and this is where it comes back to universities. Universities like to say, well, we can only do so much. Everybody likes to say we can only do so much. The sort of bird's eye view that we get at Retraction Watch suggests that everybody's saying that, and none of it's actually true. But no one also sees the need to try and pressure others and sort of affect change with others. So universities, of course, are where a lot of these algorithms and metrics, you saw the Saudi Arabia case, which is sort of extreme, but not out of place. All of these decisions, so many of these decisions are based on algorithms and metrics, particularly, of course, citation counts and the rest of it, impact factor. Everyone loses except the people who are able to game those metrics. And there are people who are able to game the metrics. Again, Mario, and I was really privileged to be able to contribute a chapter to Gaming the Metrics, the book that he co-edited. it's all there. So again, I don't know that any of this is new, but what I'm trying to do is bring it all together and give you a sense of some of my concerns, and again, obviously my thesis. So here we are in COVID. I sort of titled this "From Cancer to COVID." We journalists, we like our alliteration, so there you go. That's how you got the C's. So COVID-19 retractions. As of today, I think the latest one was it yesterday, the day before? I lose track, but there are 90 retractions of COVID-19 research. Now, is that a lot or a little? Preprints, which are often referred to in terms of retractions as withdrawals. We have some issues with that language, which I won't get into today, unless someone's fascinated or obsessed with it the way I am. The question, though, is should we be alarmed? By the way, this is the letter of the editor I was referring to, which makes me a quote unquote COVID-19 expert in the eyes of apparently publisher algorithms, peer review selection algorithms. This is just a letter to the editor that, again, Adam and I and Alison Obrightis, our researcher, who some of you may know or have worked with, has been with us for 6 years now, who again maintains our database. This was in response to a letter that, a sort of more than a letter, but a paper, an article in Accountability and Research that said there was an alarming and exceptionally high rate of COVID-19 retractions. My short answer is I'm not so sure that's true. I think that the number of retractions we've seen so far, more or less, when you look at the denominators, which, with due respect, a lot of people forget to do, if you look at the denominators based on how many papers have been published on COVID-19, it actually isn't really all that unexpected. In fact, it's basically what you would expect. The difference is that it's happening much more quickly, right? Because here we are at a year, more or less, of when papers started coming out. Retractions on average take closer to 3 years. Again, it's not an even distribution, but 3 years is sort of a better average. So that's happening more quickly. And the other thing is the reasons for retraction, it's actually pretty interesting. Most of them are not for misconduct, or at least the retraction notices don't say they're for misconduct. 11 of them are because publishers simply publish the same paper twice, and that now counts as a retraction, which is a whole other issue that I think is kind of silly, but that's how they're labeled. And so again, we're certainly seeing a big rush, but the question is, how different is all of this? And I guess I'm not all that convinced yet, and maybe I will be, or maybe I never will be, that we are living through, we're obviously living through an unprecedented time in many ways, but everything that we have seen during the pandemic in terms of scientific publishing and in terms of science, in terms of the rushing, all it is an acceleration and a sort of, and all happening under the spotlight, under the magnifying glass of an entire world in ways that it had not before. And I think that, and that's why this is a piece that Adam and I did for Wired. We tried to make that argument. You'll have to judge for yourselves whether we made the argument successfully or not. But every time there's a retraction, particularly in the major journals, there is this sort of, oh, wait, the sky's falling. This has never happened before. And that's just not true. I mean, it's so obviously not true. I do have to wonder why anyone even sort of listens to editors when they say that, but again, for another time. It's not an accident that we have a picture here above the piece of an Andrew Wakefield sort of support rally. The Lancet, 1998. Here we were with the Lancet again in 2020, looking at hydroxychloroquine and the Surgisphere debacle. Again, and every time there's a different excuse for why. Well, I don't know how we could have caught that in peer review sort of thing. I'm not terribly sympathetic, and that's being very, very kind to those sorts of arguments at this point. So I think you all know some version of this story, and I'm going to give the very quick version of it. But Adam and I launched Retraction Watch in early 2000. So again, I'm trying to bring us a little bit back in history and talk about the fact that things have changed and not changed. We launched Retraction Watch a bit more than 10 years ago. Two main reasons, and what prompted it, what inspired it, was Adam's coverage of a case that some of you may be familiar with, Scott Rubin, who is a pain researcher, and he, it turned out, made up all of the patients in his trials, ended up going to federal prison for not exactly for scientific fraud, but for closely related. In other words, the charges he went to prison for would not have happened without his scientific misconduct and his fraud, et cetera. He's had 25 retractions. That continues to be followed actually a little bit. So that's what inspired it. But then the two things that we noticed were, one, as journalists, these stories were hiding in plain sight. When the papers were retracted, there's a little, sort of signal there that nobody was paying attention to, or at least only Adam was paying attention to, essentially, and me when I remembered, which is not all that often. And so that was that's a journalism reason to do this, right? And I know we have a panel next, which I'm looking forward to, where we're going to talk about the role of journalism in all of this. But the other reason was that we'd read these retraction notices and they were, misleading, they were incomplete, they didn't tell the whole story, they didn't tell any story. Some of them were pretty good, to be fair. I'm not 100% were awful, but so many of them were awful that we thought, wait a second, there's a transparency problem. Science loves to talk about, and scientists love to talk about being self-correcting. And, I have to say that compared to a lot of other fields of human endeavor, I still think that science is often more self-correcting, but it is nowhere near as good at self-correction as I think it would like us to think it is. And so there we had a transparency, we had a sort of reason for it. Okay, we were off. As again, many of you know, we created a database because it very quickly became clear we were not keeping up with the retractions. Nobody was. And so we created a database, which as of today, we launched this in October 2018. You can go to retractiondatabase.org and check it out. I suspect many of you already have one way or another. As of today, we have just shy of 25,000 retractions in it. That's more or less double what you will see in sort of the next source, the next most comprehensive source. So we've got 25,000 retractions. We also add, of course, excuse me, reason for retraction, which we do by hand. All of this is done by hand, by the way. And again, as a sort of related argument for the need for humans, every time someone says, well, why do you need to do that by hand? They say, well, why don't you use, again, Crossref or PubMed? Those are great, but they are entirely reliant on really algorithms and metadata from publishers, which we know are deeply flawed, which I'll get to in a moment. And so we need to do this by hand. And I actually just never seen anyone. In fact, every time somebody tries and says, oh, I'm just going to create it, I'm going to write some script and do it, they prove our point for us. So I've stopped even having that argument because it's fairly obvious. So again, as many of you know, and this came up, I know, at least in one talk previously here, about anywhere, depending on how you define misconduct, sort of the federal definition, which is arguably the strictest, but some other things that I would argue are misconduct, but others may disagree. I mean, sort of like IRB, failure of IRB approval doesn't always trigger the kind of review that, a big agency might do, but, I would consider that fake peer review, which I talked about a little bit, but that's responsible, by the way, for now close to 1,000 retractions, maybe a little bit over 1,000 right now, out of, again, 25,000. That's not a zero number, that's 4%, but about anywhere from 3/5 to 2/3. So in other words, 60 to 66, 67% are due to misconduct. So you could argue that, in fact, the stigma that retractions have earned is well earned, and that's all fine to sort of argue, and I think it's fair. But again, this was a piece in Science that Science did. We worked with them on it, and they used our database for it. It was when we launched the database in October 2018. But again, this gives you a sense of why papers are retracted, and again, also gives you a sense of the growth. I don't think anyone in this audience needs to be reminded of that growth, but I'll do it anyway for posterity's sake. In the year 2000, there were about 40 retractions. Last year, there were close to 2,000 retractions. And by 2010, there were 400 retractions of papers and journals, many, many more than that if you include conference abstracts, which we actually do. But even then, you see this increasing, this growth. And people say, well, why is that true? There are people who say, well, that's because there's more misconduct. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. I'm going to get to some of that. And of course, you've heard from Elizabeth Bick already, and Dr. Bick's work actually points to at least some decent, I think, some sort of preliminary evidence that, in fact, maybe there is some increase in misconduct. But I think, at least overwhelmingly from the retractions we see, which is a little bit different from whether the misconduct is increasing, clearly it's because more people are looking at them. In other words, more people are looking at papers, everything's online, et cetera, paywalled or not, more eyeballs on it. And it's, again, a screening effect. But we have not reached peak retraction yet. The rate of retraction is about 4 in 10,000. Again, that's for papers. And it has been increasing, although it may have plateaued. It always takes a little while to tell. It's like a sort of not a leading indicator. It's the other one. I'm not an economist. But the point is that, clearly we are not at a point of how many retractions there should be. We're not even sure how many retractions there should be, but as I'll show you in a little while, clearly it's a larger number than we have. One of the things that we have clearly been paying a lot of attention to, and that I'm going to give some examples of, is just how long these take. And again, this gets to, I think, in a really direct way. Okay, you have the information, right? And these are all cases where the information was, in my eyes anyway, and I think in the eyes of even the journal editors, incontrovertible. Okay, and yet it took years. And so that top one, actually, I'm sorry, I know you're here, Elizabeth, and I'm sorry to keep quoting you. I guess it's kind of hard not to. It's hard not to in a setting like this. That quote is actually it's a headline of our post, but it's a quote from Elizabeth, from Dr. Bick, right there at the top. 6 years to perform an investigation and retract. These other two are the result of something we started doing several years ago, which is, and with, I don't actually mean apologies, but those of you who work at public universities know this, we will submit public records requests and ask for the correspondence between universities and journals once an investigation has been completed. And I want to underline that. This is after a university has done the investigation, made a finding of misconduct, said, we are asking for these papers to be retracted. The journal still, after a couple of years or even 3 years, had done nothing. Again, I don't understand. I understand the risks of legal action. I understand the fear of getting things wrong. I don't understand when you have an official letter from a vice president of research, a provost, a general counsel. What is it that is taking 2 to 3 years? Okay, and by the way, in some cases even longer. Sometimes they haven't even been retracted. I don't get it, and I'm going to need a lot of evidence to dissuade me from the notion that that's because there is not either will, resources, or both at the journal level in those cases to act on this information. Again, I'm going to run through these quickly because you've seen some of these already. I think I saw that Allison is also here. Allison Avenel, hello. This is work that she and some colleagues have done, part of a fairly large set of papers and critical work now, painstaking work. Again, the upshot is they tried to contact, this was what, 36 journals, about 36 publications. Only 40, fewer than half had actually even communicated decisions. You of course, and Jennifer, I'm not sure she's here now because of the time zones and all that, but I know she was a big part of this meeting and spoke. This is not news to any of you either, because she has, of course, talked about this paper as well. She should, but again, 31, and I think Cyril is, I think I saw Cyril somewhere. So hello, Cyril. You were of course also on this paper. Again, I'm not going to rehash all that, but just to say, journals are not responsive, and they're not the only people who are not responsive, but they are not responsive. David Allison and colleagues back in 2000, this is a 5-year-old piece now from Nature. Again, 2/3 of the time when they looked at 2 dozen papers, they didn't hear back from the journals. So again, and David Allison is not sort of, someone who randomly decides to find fault with a paper. I mean, he's a world-class statistician. He's the dean now of a public health school. These were serious errors. Journals did nothing. Again, at the risk of embarrassing Dr. Bick even more, here's, of course, the paper that I know she has discussed and others I think have discussed during this meeting. I just want to, again, the point of my sort of, not take on this, but what I want to pull out of this and just point to is at least half exhibiting features suggestive of deliberate manipulation. So if that's half of 4% roughly, so that's 2%. And we're dealing with a retraction rate right now of about 0.04%, right? So that is a big difference. I'm not a mathematician either, but I do know there's a big difference between 0.04 and 2. And so again, what are we talking about here? Why is nothing being done? Now, okay, so what? I care a lot about that. Lots of people on this call, on this session care a lot about that at this meeting. But actually, everyone in the world should care about this, because those papers, even when they do get retracted, okay, so you've gotten through that first hurdle, hurrah! Now you actually are still out in the world and people are citing you. So again, Allison is one of the co-authors of this paper, full disclosure, but John Budd, Zach Coble, both of them have done other work on this as well. Upshot of this, more than 90% of the time, retracted papers continue to be cited as if they had not been retracted. That is problematic for the literature. And again, many bucks, if not all bucks, stop here, in terms of publishing and where we are in this thread. And so again, we should care about this. Again, and various groups, including a lot of librarians like Caitlin Backer and Amy Riegelman, have looked at this. And again, quick upshot here, 40% of the time you could not tell that a paper had been retracted. Again, this is in the mental health literature, but I could give you lots of references about other kinds of literature as well, and individual researchers as well. Excuse me. So again, 40% of the time you couldn't tell. Well, we have a solution for that, right? I mentioned our database. I think many of you, if not all of you, know that we feed into Zotero. Now we have a wonderful partnership with them. You actually get an alert whenever a paper that's in your library is retracted. Even if you'd forgotten about it years before and it's just been retracted, you get an alert. Zotero is free. We're a nonprofit. I'm a volunteer. So yeah, I want you to all sign up for this, but I'm not going to make $1 if you do. So it's a sort of conflict of interest, I guess, but I would encourage you to check that out. You can do whatever you want with the information that has been retracted, but we'd encourage you to look it out. I don't have to repeat what I'm sure Boris Barber talked about this morning in terms of post-publication peer review. And I'm going to wrap up here very quickly so we can get to some conversations. But so again, this has been, and again, my own take on this and my own sort of, and full disclosure, I'm on their foundation's board of directors and another volunteer position. This has been critical. Again, many of you who are here have contributed to PubPeer, contributed comments and what have you. Many others have as well. This has opened it up and made it so that the reluctance by a lot of journals to actually sort of engage in a lot of critiques has just, I wouldn't say it's gone away at all, but it is sort of put it out in the open. I just want to point out, and again, I've mentioned some of these people, and some of you are here in the audience or have been spoken at this meeting, and it's a small, lots of text, never mind all that. These are the folks, and this list keeps growing, of the sleuths. These are the people who are actually finding these issues. I mentioned that, again, the dramatic rise in retraction since 2000 is in no doubt, as far as I'm concerned, due to more eyeballs. These are the eyeballs, right? And they all, it's really interesting. It's a bit like Darwin's finches. Again, for us as outsiders, as sort of a third or fourth party, everyone specializes a bit. And you all know this, but, plagiarism, image manipulation, statistical issues, all sorts of things. Again, great. This is the work that everyone should be paying attention to. And some of those sleuths are within the labs. I mean, some of the good news, right, if I may, is that people are coming forward about their errors, right? And so here's a grad student who, at great peril, I would argue, to her own, future, came forward and spoke to her advisor. She was right, and they retracted a paper, and that now hundreds of authors are having to look at their papers because they included the same potential mistake. Again, if I can sort of end on a somewhat more positive note, even though I think it needs to be put in context of many of the journals that are not doing this. And again, some of you are either have spoken here or are present in the audience. I know whether you feel like they should be called czars or not, that was the stat headline. But these are journals that have actually taken the steps. They've actually hired people, put the resources in, so they will be well equipped if and when all of these algorithms and all of this software comes online and is usable. They will be very well equipped. It's the other 99.9% of journals that haven't done this that will not be equipped, and actually I think it could make things worse. And finally, again, people are coming forward. This is a story. This was kind of the beginning of a story that has continued and we are not done with. But this is the Jonathan Pruitt story. The reason why Jonathan Pruitt is not here is because, and Kate Liskowski is on his picture, is because she is the one who actually, came forward first and said, there's this collaborator. I don't know what to make of the data. We're retracting this paper. She went to Twitter. Frances Arnold, Nobel Prize winner, around the same time, did the same thing. In fact, Frances Arnold did it before Flurry because they hadn't actually published the retraction yet, even though they were planning on it. So these are all good signs of change. So even if I started out sounding like a Luddite and a bit of a, devil's advocate or what have you, I hope that I can, persuade you that there's lots of good things happening, but I really encourage as much investment in the human element, if I may, as, and in human resources, as in the algorithms and the software and all of that, which again, I believe is critical, but they have to go hand in hand. So that's my last slide. I'll leave that there, and maybe Daniel, I'll stop sharing now, and we can have a conversation.